I'd had a fascination with the Bayeux Tapestry for many, many years and had embroidered several scenes for our home uh, and had stitched all the major elements of the tapestry myself. But then I discovered that a finale to the tapestry had been created by Jan Messent. And I thought, well, I might like to recreate that so that there's another version, just in case anything ever happened to hers. When another voice suggested, why don't you make it your own? And over time, I thought, well, we could do a Channel Islands one, and it could be a vehicle for teaching, especially the children of the island, why we live so close to France, yet don't belong to France, why we live so close to France, but don't speak French here. And I thought this could be a community project in which old and young alike could have a role in creating this missing element of the Bayeux Tapestry. That end has never existed in recorded history, but we're trying to create something that it might have been. And we're throwing in a couple of subtle references to the Channel Islands, because this, after all, was the beginning of the Channel Islands connection to Britain. When the Bayeux Tapestry came to the attention of the world outside Bayeux in the 1720s, the end of it was already missing. We know that from sketches that were made of it at that time, and the end just shows the death of Harold, the last struggle of the English, and the English being led off as captives. But it's in fragments, and we know that there would have been more, because the beginning of the tapestry shows Edward sitting on the throne. Close to the middle, we see Harold on the throne. Logically, there would have been William on the throne at the end. He was probably destined for some secular hall, where perhaps you would have come in through a door and seen the picture of Edward on the throne. Then you see the story of why Harold was on the throne, and then surely the conclusion with William on the throne. That was just logical. And then when they analyzed the length of the tapestry, it seemed that most of the last lengths were of a similar length. So when you look at that very final segment, it's missing somewhere between 8 to 10 feet. So we decided that we would use that measurement and set the scene for what happened between the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October, 1066, and William's coronation on December 25th, 1066. We show 4 scenes, one of William and his brothers dining on the battlefield, on the place where Harold was killed, shown by the 2 banners, his personal banner and the banner of the English king, on the ground at their feet. The second scene shows the surrender of the English when they've lost all hope of any native-born king, and so they have to accept a Norman as their king. The third scene is the coronation of William, with his Normans standing by to be his translators and attempting to avoid the chaos that actually ensued during the coronation. But the final scene is showing the ghostly image of the Tower of London, which had not yet been constructed, but which had been already planned by the time of his coronation. He was a very clever man in the way he subdued the English, and the symbol of that is this plan for the construction of the White Tower, using stone from Caen. We made such progress that we really had to slow everything down. We wanted to have enough done when the Prince of Wales arrived. So I asked people to just kind of take it easy. If they had other things to do, don't put this as a high priority until after his visit, when I knew we'd be able to move it on. Then came the summer, and we had so many visitors who wanted to put in their stitches. How the word spread, I don't know, but it was overwhelming. Although we've had a lot of stitchers, we've had at least as many, if not twice as many people who have come in to admire it, to comment on it, to learn about it, and it's been wonderful. The Bayeux Tapestry ends very shortly after the death of Harold. There's then a last struggle of the English, and then the prisoners being led off. But then the tapestry is in fragments. Over the years, too much of that end of it was destroyed. And so what we have shown is what happened on the evening of the battle. There's a tree here which indicates a scene change from when the English were being led off. We show William dining with his two half-brothers, Bishop Odo of Bayeux and Robert of Mortain. And the two of them are sitting there. They know that they drank champagne, but it was long before the bubbles had been added to the champagne, so it was just a white wine. And the Bay Tapestry shows that being brought over, so they were obviously good wine drinkers at the time. What else they ate, we can't really be sure, but we've shown them eating bread and fish. But they're dining on the hill with all the dead and dying around them. It must have been quite a gruesome occasion, but this was perfectly normal for medieval battles. You occupied the hill after the battle to prove that you were the victor. In the lower border, we show a little eavesdropper. He, we know, is an eavesdropper because he's raised his little finger, and that was the sign to people who were not literate of what his role was. So he's just watching the proceedings, perhaps to tell the English what has happened following that battle. Then we have another little man here carrying off his friend who's been wounded in the battle, while weapons are collected in piles. The weapons were extremely expensive for those days, and nothing was going to be wasted. As soon as a man was killed, he was stripped of his armor, and that was collected by the victors. We also show beasts here who are busy consuming the bodies of the dead. Actually, this didn't happen on the 14th. This happened after the fact because there are two English women who are being shown. They actually arrived on the next day. The Normans only buried their own, the Bretons buried their own, and the English were left on the field. If the women came and said that this was a body that belonged to them and they would take it away for burial, they were allowed to do that. But otherwise, the English dead were left for what are known as the beasts of the battle. Scene 2, it shows the surrender of the English nobles to William, but it's jumped forwards in time, and we need to go back and fill in some of the history first. After the Battle of Hastings, William waited for the English to come to him and ask him to be their king, but they didn't come. So instead, he went on to Romney. Two of his ships had gone to Romney by mistake, and the crews had been slaughtered. So William slaughtered the citizens of Romney. He destroyed the town. After that, he went on to Dover, which was a fortified city and could have put up some resistance. But having seen what happened in Romney, instead they opened their gates and submitted to William. Now that gave William a base from which he could get reinforcements of supplies and men. And so he was now in a much stronger position. But he went on to Canterbury, where Canterbury also submitted. Canterbury was the religious heart of the country, and so having accepted the submission of the leaders of the church, or at least of the town which represented the leaders of the church, William was in a stronger position there as well. But by this time, many of his soldiers and William himself contracted dysentery. William nearly died, and while he was recovering, 500 of the Norman knights went, as they hoped, to take the submission of London. London put up a fight, and they repulsed the Normans at Southwark. So the Normans went back to Canterbury, where by this time William had recovered enough to resume command, and instead of taking London, he decided he would go west, and he cut a swathe through the English countryside, destroying everything, and on the way received the submission of Winchester. Now, Winchester had been the ancient capital of England, and the Dowager Queen, Edith, was residing there. She submitted to William at this point as well. So then he turned north and crossed the Thames at Wallingford. From Wallingford, he turned back east, and this cut off the defenders of London so that they couldn't get much in the way of supplies or reinforcements themselves. They knew that they had no choice. They had to surrender. So at Berkhamsted, the nobles of London are shown surrendering. That's what this caption says. Here at Berkhamsted, the nobles of London surrender. The nobles shown are the two northern earls, the Earl of Northumberland, Edwin, and the Earl of Mercia, Morcar, his brother. They are shown with the Archbishop of York, who was in London. The Archbishop of Canterbury had submitted at Wallingford. And we show little Edgar the Atheling. He was the last descendant of the English royal house, the last descendant of King Alfred. And they had chosen him as the king after the Battle of Hastings. But he was only 12 or 14 years of age. He'd been born in Hungary. When he arrived in England at about the age of 7, he couldn't even speak English. He had no land, no followers in England that he could command himself. And he didn't have a sufficiently charismatic personality to attract a strong following from the English. So basically, they knew they had to accept William as king at this point. The upper border throughout most of our finale shows pairs of animals. Now, this is typical of the rest of the Bayeux Tapestry. It seems to be one of the instructions that was given to the embroideresses, that they should have bars and pairs of animals. So we followed that tradition as well. But in this scene, we show the other Channel Islands reference. It's a complete anachronism. It's this image with a man sitting at his desk pointing to a knight. He represents someone that we would tend to call Wace, but was probably known as Was in that time. He was born in Jersey. He became a monk, but when he was a young man, he said his father, who was with William, told him that William sailed with 700 less 4 ships. So he's the only one who gives us an exact number of ships that sailed. He says he knows this because of his father having been with William. We don't know if his father was a knight, but we've shown him as a knight because that implies that he was part of the battle group. If you look at the Normans who are with William, you can see that their spears are pointing up towards Was and his father, and that is also trying to show that there's a connection between them. But Was was writing in the 1160s or 70s, so we think it's stretching it a bit that his father was actually with William. He may have meant his grandfather, but we can't be sure. In the lower border are 2 wyverns. Wyverns were mythical animals. They were dragon-like, but with a curl in their tail. So our wyverns do show the curve in their tail. And they represent the differences of understanding that occurred between the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, because these wyverns have 2 different tongues. They spoke with different languages, but they also had misunderstandings of the meaning of submission. For an Englishman to submit to a lord meant that he would guarantee to fight for the lord, when required, in exchange for the lord's protection of his rights. For the Normans, when you submitted, everything you owned, everything that was controllable in your life belonged to the man you submitted to. So when the English submitted to William, they thought they were just choosing another king, in effect. But that wasn't the case, and William assumed that England, all of England, was his to give away as he chose. So he had a huge misunderstanding. I think that both he and the Duchess were fascinated by how the project was created and what we were trying to do. They knew that it was an original end of the tapestry that we were creating. They knew the tapestry would have ended with William's coronation, and they were very pleased to see that that was included and very excited about putting in their contribution. We were thrilled they gave us the time that they did. Scene 3 is the coronation itself, and in the lower border we see the intention that William had, at least what we assume was his intention, because it's a scene of hunting. There are many scenes of hunting in the Bayeux Tapestry, both in the main panel and in the borders. And this was the major occupation of the nobility in peacetime. So we're trying to say William intended to have a peaceful reign. He'd conquered England, or at least he'd won the Battle of Hastings, and so now he wanted to settle down and have a happy, peaceful reign in England. Then, for the coronation itself, you could already tell things were not going his way. He was crowned by the Archbishop of York, Aldred, and Aldred exacted a promise from him that he would rule justly and obey the laws by which England had been ruled. which he promised he would do. It was only after that that the crown could be set on his head. But Aldred also asked the people of the congregation, would they accept William as their king? By the way, this has happened on Christmas Day in Westminster Abbey. Well, when that call came out to the English people, they shouted out, yes, they would have William as their king. But of course, they're speaking in Old English. Geoffrey of Coutances, the Bishop of Coutances, was a very close friend of William's, and he had been asked to stand by at this coronation as translator. And we don't know if he didn't get his translation out quickly enough or misunderstood what was going on, but the Normans assumed that the cry of the English of acclamation was actually a cry to rise in rebellion, and panic ensued. William is known to have been shaking from head to foot, and usually they say in fear. But I have a sneaking suspicion with the man of that character, he was probably angry. Whatever the case, the coronation ended up as a bit of a fiasco. The congregation fled from the abbey, and when the crown was set upon his head, there were very few people there other than the officiating party, so it wasn't quite the magnificent occasion that he anticipated. When all this chaos occurred inside the abbey, the Normans who were outside perhaps took an opportunistic move, but they went on to Southwark and burned Southwark. We show that in the lower border. That may have been in punishment for their earlier defeat. That we can't know. We only know that there was chaos in the abbey, the congregation fled, and the Normans destroyed Southwark. That's more or less the story of our coronation scene, but the inscription at the top only says, here they gave the crown of the kingdom to William. We've now had 299 stitchers who have put in at least one stitch, and many who've put in a lot more. So the next new person who comes to stitch on this will be our 300th. And as I say, there have been many more who've come to visit the project, so we're overwhelmed. The last scene, it really ties in with the coronation. It's more or less happening at the same time. When William was crowned, there were the three estates of English society that were all accepting him as their king. They really had no other choice. Harold was dead, his brothers were dead. His sons wouldn't have been recognized by the church because they were the children of what was known as a handfast wife, or a wife who was married in the Danish mode. So they weren't married in a church, and the church had long established that only the children of people married in church could rule, which is ironic in view of William's now being crowned. However, the three estates of society were those who pray, the clergy, those who fight, the nobles, and those who work, the peasants. All three are shown acclaiming William. The inscription here was very cleverly done. Our inscriptions were written for us by Robin Whicker, who's quite a Latin scholar, and they're written in the Latin that would have been current at that time. But this phrase says, and here the English acclaim the king. He's not saying William, it's the king they are acclaiming. So they're acclaiming the office of a kingship, in effect, rather than William. It's subtle, but it was intentional. Now, all these three levels accepted William on his promise of good government. As we know from history, that wasn't the way it turned out. And because the Alderney Tapestry was written after the actual conquest of England, which took place over the next few years, and which left the English a much impoverished nation in comparison to what they had been, we have a little commentary in the lower border, just under William. This is an image from Aesop's fable of the wolf and the lamb, in which the wolf says to the lamb, I'm going to eat you for my dinner because you've been eating the grass in my field. And the lamb says, I can't have been eating the grass in your field because I've only drunk my mother's milk. So he says, I will eat you for my dinner because you've been drinking from my stream. And he says, but I haven't been drinking from your stream and polluting your water. I've been drinking downstream from you. And the wolf says, I think I'll eat you for my dinner anyway. And the moral of that is the tyrant finds an excuse to achieve what he wants. And that image is showing to us that William was really trying to achieve English by any means necessary. The entire Bay of Tapestry seems to be an attempt to say Harold was a perjurer. Harold did not deserve to be the king, and it was God's punishment of him that made him lose the Battle of Hastings. Well, that's what I think was the excuse that William was using to take the English crown. There is no real proof that any oath was sworn. If an oath was sworn, it is never stated what that oath was. So the whole question of Harold's perjury is highly questionable. And I rather think that it doesn't come into play. An English king was chosen entirely differently. He was elected by a council of nobles and high churchmen. That wasn't the case in Normandy, where you could just give the crown, the crown of the dukedom in this case, by your personal choice. That wasn't so in England. And so we had another of those misunderstandings of customs and usage, which was to plague the English and the Normans for a few hundred years after that. Then we have our little Channel Islands image, the second one, the one that I think is perhaps our heart of the tapestry for the Channel Islands. It shows the Guernsey donkey, the Jersey toad, and the Alderney puffin, with the tail of the English lion curving around them to represent that this was the point at which we came under the protection of the English crown. And the last image, I shouldn't say the last image, because we haven't talked about the Tower of London, which is very important here. This coronation took place on the 25th of December. That's just 2.5 months after the Battle of Hastings. And already by then, William had chosen the site for the Tower of London. It was really through the building of fortifications that the Normans were able to subdue the English. Wherever they went, they were master builders, and they built very strong fortifications into which they could retreat whenever they were in any danger. Having chosen the site for the Tower of London, he brought over stone from Caen, the famous white stone of Caen. And that is why we have a French tower on English soil as one of our earliest monuments.